Hello, my name is Josh Swaminas, and I am here with Elaine Howard Ecklund, who is a sociology professor at Rice University. We've been friends for a while, and today we're going to talk about her new book, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other. But I got to tell you right from the start that I really don't like the title of this book. I think it kind of is misleading about what's really happening here. This is a book that's really targeted. I don't think it's really making the argument that faith and science need each other, but rather how there can be a productive exchange with common ground between communities of faith and scientists. And I think Elaine sees the world really as a sociologist in many ways. And so when she talks about science, she defines it really beautifully as a community of scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And faith is really community. And in this case, she's talking about the Christian faith. So it's a community of Christians. And there's overlap in those communities. And what could a better sort of exchange between those two worlds be? I have a lot of affection for Elaine. We've spent a lot of time talking about a lot of common values and things that we care about together. So it's a real privilege to have her here to talk to her. She's also really a world-renowned sociologist who might be the leading person out there really studying the sociology, the science of studying scientists and religious people interacting with one another, and really trying to make sense out of this big, gigantic mess at times, it seems. And maybe can give us some insight about how to find a better way. So, Elaine, can you tell us a little more about yourself and introduce yourself to people who are listening in?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. It's really a privilege to be here, and I appreciate the work you're doing through Peaceful Science a great deal, and your own writing and your scientific work. So, thanks for having me. It's a real privilege to be with you. So I'm a sociologist, and the past.
What do sociologists do? Because all of a sudden, scientists are like, wait a minute, are sociologists really scientists or not? Like,
oh gosh, I don't get embroiled in that debate, but so we're very interested in how groups behave, and a general axiom of sociology is that people behave differently in groups than they do on their own. So we're interested in looking at the group as a kind of self-conscious actor and studying what groups do in the world. So I think you're exactly right that certainly science can be understood in different kinds of ways, but the piece of science that I'm interested in is the scientific community. And what religious scientists do in particular, I spent about the past 15 years studying scientists' attitude toward religion and religious people's attitudes towards science. I'm really interested in how religious identities cut and cross-cut with other kinds of identities like racial identities and scientific identities. And so some of my recent work has been really concerned with how churches in particular can encourage more Black and Hispanic peoples in the U.S. to be interested in science. So you can ask me questions.
That's a great example where there's potentially an unexpected way for collaboration. Because I'd say most scientists I know deeply care about creating a more equitable type of science, one that actually includes more minorities. But the scientific community doesn't always have the deepest connection to those communities. And but then when you think about things like the Black church, where have just been historical places where, you know, the African American community at least is gathered, maybe there is a way for us to be a better church in a way that also helps and welcome people into science better and serves that common good, right?
I do think so. So I would say in general, and my studies have really borne this out, in general, scientists who are not people of faith see religion as being, you know, a kind of benign or separate influence for science in the best case, or a kind of problem for science in the worst case. Very rarely would the general scientific community see religion and religious communities as helping and supporting science. And I think if we move a little bit more in that direction, and I don't know, I know you perhaps think this as well, and I'd love to be in dialogue more about it, but if we move more in the direction of seeing religion as having some possibilities to help science rather than being a problem for science. I always say, let's move from viewing science as for religion as a problem to a possibility. There may be ways in which an interest in science could be actually birthed in church communities. So that's something that I've really been interested in my most recent work. And then in particular in communities, Hispanic communities and Black communities where you have 60, 70, 80%, depending on the survey, of people in those communities actively involved in churches. And I use church specifically here because most of those folks are committed Christians. They're less likely to be part of non-Christian faiths like Islam or Hinduism. And those places could be places that could really collaborate with the scientific community. And also, our research shows that Hispanic and Black communities in particular provide a lot of education support, religious communities, I mean, and provide after-school programs often. So what if you had, scientists coming in, particularly scientists of color who are also Christians, coming into after-school programs, and the NSF or the NIH seeing that as a legitimate outreach for those agencies. I know scientists have to do outreach as part of their research grants often. So what if that were a generative and expected outreach that scientists for whom it had relevance might actually collaborate with faith communities in that way?
Yeah, I think that's actually entirely possible. But before we go down that rabbit hole, which I really care a lot about, and we do care a lot about at Peaceful Science, should talk a little about your book here. So, like I said, I don't like the title. I don't have a replacement title for you, but I think it helps to kind of define the audience and what you're trying to accomplish here. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So this is my 7th book, and all of my other books have been written specifically for an academic audience, a kind of general academic audience or a readerly public. But this is the first book that I've written specifically for church communities. So our team at the Religion and Public Life
program, not just like the super educated people. I mean, it's really written on a very accessible level, right? And you share a lot of your story in it, which I really like.
I do. So our team at the Religion and Public Life program, which is where I do most of my research and most of my collaborations are at Rice University, as I said, studied these topics for about 15 years. And we have found that Christians have kind of a unique relationship to science. And so it's a little bit different, I think, than what we might hear in the media or even from some among those in the science community. Christians are actually really pro-science. Christian parents would be happy if their children married someone who is a scientist or a physician or in the scientific community. That's one of the ways that sociologists like myself measure social distance. It's one thing to be okay with someone being in your neighborhood, but actually having them as part of your family.
Is there any group that would be disappointed if their kid married a scientist?
Not really, but we would expect that, given the kind of stereotypes that we have, that Christians might not be, especially more conservative Christians or Christians that we think of as more traditional. And so we do find that there's a kind of an appreciation for science in general, but Christians do think scientists are against them. They fear that when their children meet scientists in university environments, that scientists will take their children away from the Christian faith. And so being exposed to this research for a number of years, and then, being a Christian myself, being involved in a church community, I thought perhaps I should be motivated to do outreach to my own community. I sort of wanted to take my own pill that I was encouraging other people to take, where I really encourage scientists and social scientists to try to bring their work back to their community. And I thought, well, these are my people to some extent, and this is my community. And so maybe I should have some sort of moral responsibility to bring this message home to them and try to write some sort of book that would really help them understand how to be in interaction with scientists and with scientific ideas. And yeah,
so it's like your first popular book in a sense.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think, you still might be able to call it like a little bit like a qualitative research, maybe, I don't know. Because you do spend a lot of time, you tell a lot of your story, you also spend a lot of time quoting these like in-depth interviews that are probably part of other academic studies, right?
That's right. So the findings and the things that I present in this book are based on 5 different studies that our team has done. And then I did something.
How many interviews or how many different people did you quote through this book? Do you know?
Well, pieces of probably about 500 interviews. And then I interviewed 15 folks who I just think are interesting, who are Christians, who are scientists, and I think have thought really deeply about this we think of these folks, these kinds of people in research terms, as being kind of key informants. If we want to say, here's what it's like to live out X idea, let's find someone who's doing it.
So the really strange thing about reading this book for me, because I was reading through this book, and it was surprising at a certain point. Well, partly because I'm like, okay, this is not what I expected because of the title, right? But then I started reading it and realizing, wait a minute, that quote sounds really familiar. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I think I'm one of the people she's quoting. And of course, it's anonymous. And then I remember back, oh yeah, I had a conversation with Elaine a couple of years ago, and here I am. And I kind of kept on popping up in a couple ways. I was mentioning before how, on one hand, you quoted me, but there's other times what I thought was really interesting where I would read someone and I think, oh, there she quoted me again, but now I know who the key is, who I am, which number. So I go back to the notes and I realize, oh, it's someone else, which is encouraging in a way too, because it seems like some of the things that I've come to really see and care about as a kind of a person who's a scientist in the church and a Christian in science ends up to be common with how other people think about it too. And to the point where I couldn't even tell if it was me or someone else saying it, looking at your footnote. But I think that is something that really made this book special. I was talking to my wife about it, actually, as I was reading and saying, oh, Victoria, you got to really read this. I think this really gives a voice to a really small community that I just don't think is heard that often. And that, some of us are somewhat quiet and private too, and we're not out there publicly. So even our scientific colleagues don't really know what we think about these things, and our family doesn't always know. So it was actually something where I thought this could actually give a great deal of insight to those of us who are kind of at that boundary, between those two worlds. So that was really meaningful, actually, to read that.
Thank you. That's a huge compliment, Josh. Thank you for that. I do think the best sociology tells people's stories well in the aggregate, if that makes sense. So we want to tell as truthfully as we can people's individual stories and say, well, does my story map on to other people like me? So that's what I think of as good sociology. So I thought, is there a way I could do that?
It's not just like a bunch of quotes. You actually organized it along really, I would say probably you kind of start out with 3 basic ideas, but then you focus on 8 virtues and you divide them into 4 types of virtues. And you can kind of see how there's actually some pretty strong themes that bind those together. Did you know from the outset you're going to be talking about virtues? What brought you to the idea of having virtues as a point of dialogue and conversation and a crossroads between these two worlds?
Yeah, so I did these 5 studies, and then I thought I almost, if I can put it in these terms to you, I almost felt a sense of purpose or call to write a book for the Christian community. And I woke up one day, I feel like this is not how research should proceed, but in the ideal, typical way, but this is how it happened for me. I woke up one day and I thought, what is it that could hold Christian communities and scientific communities together? What could be some kind of common ground? And so then I started analyzing the interviews I'd done with scientists and the interviews I'd done with Christians who are not scientists over the years. And I started talking about, started analyzing according to the instances in the interviews when they talked thoughtfully and positively about each other, where they talked about learning from each other. And I came to the idea of values and virtues as kind of sets of ideas and practices that could hold these communities together. And if we were to really drill deep on something like humility as a common kind of value or virtue between the scientific and the Christian community, that actually might bring common ground and be a more useful way to talk about it, then usually we talk about this in terms of ideas which are compatible or conflicting. We very rarely talk about virtues or practices that might really bring the communities together.
Yeah, this is another thing that I really loved about your book. So you're right. I think that where people really fixate on is like, do you agree on some sort of abstract idea?
That's right.
And or maybe epistemologically, can you use science to prove that? Can you use religion to do that? And there's like a comment here. Someone says, I'll put this out because it's actually typical. Surely, unless I'm really dumb, science doesn't need faith. For centuries without it. Well, there's just a lot there because, clearly, I think Brian actually understands faith as something different than what we mean by it right now. I mean, I can say
That's
that
right.
for certain, because I mean, the earliest scientists were actually Christians in that sense, of a sociological sense. So if you got rid of them, there wouldn't be science in some sense. But even more, maybe science is trust. But we also do see these conflicts at times between ideas, right?
We absolutely do. Yeah.
And I think what you're saying is that maybe that's actually not where you should locate the conversation primarily. The private conversation could be primarily located in actually people that are intersecting between these worlds, is one thing you point out. And then the idea is like common values and different ways of approaching those common values. And I think that's actually exactly right. I mean, that's how I see it. It's interesting too, because independently, I'm sure, we kind of came to some ideas of peaceful science, and we're really oriented around 8 values too. It's different 8 values. There's a couple common ones. One of them is curiosity as a really core value, and another one is humility. And one actually has like a core, the way how you talk about honesty actually, and is connected to how we talk about rigor. And rigor and honesty, and then also kind of overall, you call it shalom, but we really see peace as like an intrinsic good, seeking common good.
That's right. Yeah.
That's how I put it. So it was really cool to see those parallels, and so you just really seem to see that naturally as a direction to go. Can you tell us more about why that's the direction to go? And I think it's important to unpack a bit more, because you're not really saying that science takes and faith, or churches, scientists and Christians take hold of these values in the same way, or we conceive them in the same way, right? Are you? I mean, you're more saying that that's a point of a place where there could be commonality and also differences. And exploring that and kind of wrestling that could be a more productive way to engage. Is that what you're saying, or how would you put it?
So I chose to focus on values and virtues in part because of what I know from broader social science work. So if our problematic is to draw two communities together, the best way to do that is not to look for the place where there's boundaries, but to look for the place where there's overlap. And so I started, usually when I talk to pastors of churches who are fearful of science, they will say, how can I defend my church? Or parents who are Christian parents who are fearful of science, how can I defend my child and my child's education against these ideas? But what if we completely change that to say, to believe that science is an inherent good? If we as Christians think that science too is created by God as a way to understand the natural world, the biological world, then what if we looked at that instead as what are the things that we have in common? What are the values that we could potentially share? Not to say that some people might not, some people will see disagreements, but what are the values that we share? And these are the values that I noticed in the research that I've done so far as coming up most often, that there was some kind of evidence in the interview data in particular that I've collected and the observational data that we've collected that pointed toward these values. Yeah.
Let's expand on them a bit. So I have your, you can't really see it that well, but I have the table of contents here.
I'm so glad, because I don't know if I fully memorized them. You know how it is. After you write the book, then you go on and write another book and you're like, please don't test me on this.
Yeah, that's how I should turn it around. Can you tell me what, anyways, you talk about values values that are oriented towards process. And I also want to point out too, one set of studies you reference is the stuff by the Virtues Project by Robert Pennock, looking at scientific virtues and how scientists think about virtues. And it's interesting because the top one they put out there actually, I think, is humility to data, or in honesty, I think, are two of the top ones there. But regardless, these are the ones you put out. You put curiosity as one, you put doubt, humility, and creativity. And then in terms of redemption, you talk about healing, awe, shalom, which is another word for peace, and gratitude. Now, the one that sticks out to me, though, is doubt. Do faith communities really value doubt? That's the part where I'm kind of wondering, what are you really getting at here?
Yeah, so the scientists that I have interviewed over the course of my studies who are Christians, and I think it's really apt for you, Josh, to point out that the folks who we might look to most embody, really live these common values might be scientists who are themselves Christians, right? And how could church leaders and others in the Christian community really cultivate those folks, I think is something interesting, for Peaceful Science to think about, for me to think about, and others who care about these issues. So those would be the folks we might think of as embodying these values the most potentially. And that's something that scientists who are Christians really had come to terms with in their own work. And as well as and this comes experientially really from my own history as well, which, as you said, I wrote into the book, and I'm happy to talk more about that and why I did that if you want to pick up on that thread. But I think it's good if you're writing for your community to be transparent about your own story and relationship to that community. So that's a kind of conviction I have, and so I decided to do that. But I do think that there is a sense where doubt is something that Christians who have a very deep faith have learned how to deal with. And it's not that one always doubts about the same things over the entire course of their life, but to wrestle with healthy doubt. I think of, in the biblical story of Thomas. Yeah.
Is doubt really a virtue?
Yeah, that's something that's interesting to think on. So I'm no philosopher, and there's folks who've written lots about this.
Even if it is, do Christians generally see it as a positive? I mean, I can actually see how doubt can be a virtue. It's kind of a protection against a certain type of, to use theological language for once, a protection against a certain type of idolatry, where we kind of take man-made idols, we put them up in replacement of God. But if we can't ever doubt them, we can never really let them go.
Yeah. The danger, I think I say that in the book, that the danger is not so much well-placed doubt as it is certainty, right? So, which acts very much against humility, right? That we kind of think we know the whole truth, that we have a kind of certainty, which leads to odd sorts of fundamentalisms and things like that. So,
well, I think the part where I think that does make sense is that the way I would put it is I think maybe some church communities value doubt, but I'd say a lot of them really are fearful of it, and they don't understand it, especially when it comes to the children in their congregations and those that start to be influenced by science in ways that they don't expect or want. But I think with a better engagement with science, they could understand it, and maybe it wouldn't be quite so frightening, and they'd understand how to make sense of that doubt in a way that actually leads to a more resilient faith.
And I think that's something that could be more thoughtfully cultivated. So it's the scientists who are Christians who had really wrestled with their faith alongside their scientific understanding. There are, of course, some folks who are people of faith who are scientists who really keep these things compartmentalized, right? So I'm talking about the folks who are scientists who are Christians who have really wrestled with integration and what that means and what it means to live out their science as a type of Christian calling. So that's what I'm talking about. And I have found that those folks have found a way to think about doubt as a kind of healthy virtue, that doubt, wrestled with rightly in the right kind of community can actually be very healthy. Yeah.
So, you've been talking to a lot of religious folk and a lot of scientists for a while, and a lot of Christians who are scientists or scientist Christians, whatever you want to call us. What's the weirdest thing about the scientists for religious people to really get their head around, to understand? Like, what's that? What's the weird thing about us, or are we really just like everyone else?
I like to think of Thomas in the biblical story of Thomas. He was the disciple. We often call him Doubting Thomas, right? He was the one who had to actually, touch Christ. And, so I think of him as like one of the first scientists. So these are folks who often at a very young age are really inquisitive. So people who go on to hold faculty positions like you do as scientists at top research universities probably started out at a very young age as being really, really inquisitive children. And I think sometimes Christians are really afraid of that level of inquiry. I mean, we're sometimes, I think, wrongly taught in Christian communities that the Christian faith is a fragile faith, that if it's pushed too much, that it will disappear or break down. And certainly in popular culture, we're taught that as well. And so for our scientists and for our deeply inquisitive children, we need to not buy into the idea that the Christian faith is fragile, that we need to trust that God is much larger than we are. And so I think you asked what's the weirdest thing, and I'm departing a little bit from that question. I don't know if it's weird or not, but I think that everyday Christians are afraid of just how inquisitive scientists are. I remember interviewing this woman who's a Christian, who's not a scientist, who said, I just think scientists are out to just poke holes in Christian faith and say, oh, if I poke holes in that rock in the ground will show that the earth is really much older than the Christian faith teaches. And so it's not so much what you believe about evolution, but although I know that's very, very important for scientists and some people, but it's more about this idea that scientists are kind of out to get them to poke holes in things. And I think it's not so much that scientists are out to poke holes in Christian faith specifically. I think they're people who poke at everything, right? They're people who are predisposed to poking, and that there is a kind of goodness. There's also a kind of goodness in not being predisposed to poking. So, right, they're just kind of being settled with seeing things the way that they are. There's a kind of goodness to that, but there's a deep goodness to trying to understand more and more about how the world works, to really poke holes in things. And that kind of extreme inquisitive nature is often not been welcome in church communities. And so embracing some of these values like humility and doubt will, I think, make churches places where that kind of inquisitive nature can be fostered. And we might birth a whole new generation of excellent scientists right out of the center of our church communities.
Yeah, but they also might kind of turn a lot of things upside down if they're being willing to poke and be inquisitive in things, right?
Yeah.
So is that really what we want? I hope so, but that also might be a little bit, unsettling for some people.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think one thing that drew me to science immensely was the sense of how untamed it was. That you didn't know where it was going to go. You didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know until Monday that they were going to find phosphine in Venus. That potentially there was going to be life there. Like, that's exciting. It's a tiny little detail. And then I think we're close to kind of getting to, Paul Rimmer is on the Peaceful Science Forum. He's one of the key authors of that study. And so we're going back and forth with him about the technical details of how do they really know it's phosphine gas, going into deep details of spectroscopy and all this and that, and just having a fun time engaging this deep question. And that's, I think, untamed. I mean, you don't know where it's going to go. And even as you hear the authors talk about it, they don't know if the discovery is going to be confirmed or not. It's completely up in the air. And there's just something so exciting and being part of something that's important. It engages grand questions, and you don't know where it's going to go. You don't know if it's going to challenge or confirm your beliefs. And you're in a community where there's enough standards in place. People are basically honest, and if they're not, they're gonna pay a cost for it. So you can trust each other a little bit and start kind of navigating this. And it's just a really grand thing to join. And it's something that I didn't always experience in the church, honestly. Where it seemed at times, some of the churches, not all the churches, but some of the churches I went to, they really wanted a very tame sort of experience that was very well controlled, and they could know where it was going to go. And if there was anything that seemed to disrupt that railroad track, that was something to be concerned about. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do. I have two examples which quickly come to mind. So once I was, that's really beautiful what you just said, Josh. Thanks for that. I was at this weird conversation once in Cambridge with Jennifer Weissman, who you maybe know, who's the NASA scientist. Yeah. And it was about exoplanets. And I don't know how Elaine got invited to this, because I think it was something they wanted to talk about the theological implications of exoplanets. So
exoplanets, for those following along who don't know, they're just planets around other solar systems that are orbiting other stars. Go ahead.
Thank you for that. Thank you. That was needed because I did not know that before I went into this conversation. So they talked about the theological implications of exoplanets. So what if we discover all kinds of these new planets, and what if they have life on them? And so the possibilities of life on exoplanets and what theological implications that I have. And so what they that this kind of discovery would have. And so we went around the table and we were supposed to discuss our views. It was all physicists, astronomers, and theologians. And then we got to me. And I can say nothing. This is just not an area of knowledge that I have any background in. I know nothing. So all I could say was, isn't it interesting that some people care about this? but the people, I mean, literally, that's what I study, is like why you would care about this, right? What it is about you and your background that would make you care about such a thing. But the people, as related to your story, the people around the table were so fascinated and so challenged. But that kind of thing doesn't challenge my faith at all, because I know nothing about it. Like it's just really, I don't even know what the words mean that they're talking about. But so that was my response. And someone turned to Jennifer Weissman, who, as you know, is a very committed Christian, and said, does this bother you? And she said, oh no, I've known for years that this kind of thing could happen, and God is large enough for this. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was such a neat response. Obviously, there's much more that needs to be said, but I thought, oh gosh, that's just such a neat response to have a sense like, isn't this exciting? Something else that we'll get to figure out or know or get a glimpse into. I was just going to say quickly, the other example is there was, of course, the CRISPR-Cas9 technologies have led to lots of different kinds of things, right? So that we have the recent case of actually editing the germline, and there are all kinds of ethical implications, and potentially if we can use human reproductive genetic technologies and gene editing to edit future generations of genetics, like what kind of ethical implications does that have? And some of that is very scary ethically. And I was on another panel. I don't know how I get on these panels. I was on another panel about this. Again, I don't really know very much about the science of it. But one of the scientists who was present there, who's a very committed Christian, said, this will be a great opportunity for the church to reflect ethically alongside scientists. And these scientists really need thoughtful Christians who aren't afraid to enter into the mire of these issues and really think deeply about how the ethical perspective of the Christian faith could shed light on how our societies should deal with these new technological possibilities. And I thought that was a neat kind of thing to say, that the Christian faith might hold something within it that could come alongside science and provide scientists some kind of framework in conversation. And he said it in a way that was really gentle, which I know is the kind of thing that you're trying to communicate through the work you're doing through Peaceful Science, is kind of deep collaboration and gentle spirit, which I think doesn't come through intense fear. He said it without a sense of fear, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, I think the way you put it actually is to say we need to move from fear towards understanding, right? I think it's a good way to put it. I had the privilege of actually being invited to speak to homeschool kids that are all young Earth creationists quite a few times, and their parents keep on inviting me back, which has been really a privilege. I I affirm evolution, but somehow they trust me to talk to their kids about evolution and things like that. But a common thing that comes up, and then they ask for the advice, and one of the most common pieces of advice that I give that makes a lot of sense to them is they say, you don't have to agree with evolution to understand it. And the first thing you should do is just think about Proverbs 4:7. When all you're getting, get understanding. The first thing you should seek is to understand. And, if you understand things, that's wisdom. That's how wisdom arises. So, rather than just saying, no, it's not true, so I don't want to learn about it and know about it, just have that type of confidence, that type of open-handedness to kind of leave the fishbowl and really, kind of enter that untamed world and to understand, even if you disagree. And I think that's actually been something that even a young Earth creationist homeschool mom and kid can look at and say, oh, maybe that is a better way than just being insular. Because not everyone that's part of Peaceful Science is Christian, but if you are a Christian, we should know that, we follow Jesus because God raised him from the dead. And that's how we know that God is good and exists and wants to be known. Whether or not evolution is true, whether or not the Earth is old, whether or not, Adam and Eve are real. All that stuff just pales in comparison to who Jesus is and how we know about him. That's our foundation. And from there, we can kind of move forward to kind of hold these other things, even those things that we've been taught to maybe cling tightly to, we can hold them with more open hands. And I think why I've thrived, and I think a lot of people who do thrive in science thrive there, is because we've just come to really love the untamed world of science. It's a great world. But anyways, I'm kind of talking a little bit too much. You are my guest. Do you have any more stories to tell us?
I like what you're saying about an untamed world. I do think that our Christian faith has become too tame, and and it's become, I don't want to get, everyone's talking about politics now, and it's so overwhelming, the kind of polarization that's happening in our society, that we're having a pandemic. And I hope Christians don't hide in the midst of this. So I'm always wanting to encourage folks to really wrestle deeply with what it means to be a Christian in these very, very, very hard situations and really hard times. We have a theology of suffering, and we're seeing, deep suffering right now. So what does it mean to bring that to bear? And one of the values that I raised, I do think scientists who have thought about it really want to address suffering through their work. They want to do work which alleviates suffering in humanity. I know the colleagues that you work with, I'm sure, are thinking about that as well. And that's something where Christians and scientific communities coming together. I think sometimes Christians don't acknowledge enough the suffering that's going on in the world and our role in contributing to it, right? And as well as the possibilities that we can be agents of alleviating that suffering. So I think that's something to think about in these times in particular.
Well, I think what we're in the moment of right now, and why I think it's really important to take your advice very seriously, thinking through what it means to be Christian in these contexts, or a scientist if you're not a Christian, or just to be, I'd say, like a truly moral, civically minded person that's doing good for the common good when we can't even agree what the common good is. I think we're in a time of disruption right now, and I think times of disruption are very unsettling at times. They can cause a lot of financial uncertainty for us personally, for people we know, and frankly, as a professor at WashU, the uncertainty isn't nearly as bad for me as it is for many people in society too. But I think the strength out of I think the strength, or the value, I would say, of disruption is that there's an opportunity that things could be very different on the other end, and potentially very different in a better sense. And I'm 41 right now. I'm about to turn 42. When I look at kind of the generation before me and their leadership in society, I don't have that many good things to say about most of them. There's got to be a better way to being a Christian in society than what I've seen in that generation of leaders. And it makes me think, how can I be a better leader? But then also, when I talk to students, they all know this. It's not like this is super threatening or something they disagree with. They look at these leaders and they want something better. And I think with the time of disruption, there's a chance that maybe we could actually try and take hold of something better too. Is that possible? Is that how sociological change happens? Or
that's right. A disruption can be crushing, right? It can be crushing, especially for those who are most at risk, are most on the margins of society. So there's certainly that can happen. Any kind of inequality, when there is, during this pandemic, during this economic downturn, we're seeing those inequalities grow much, much greater. But during times of disruption, we could also see massive ingenuity and creativity. And I think that's what you're alluding to, that there is the possibility for, some sociologists have called it unsettled times. Well, we're in one of the most deeply unsettled times any of us will ever experience, where everything we thought we knew is being really turned up. And that a lot of people are asking the question, is there a better way? And when you have whole collectives of people asking that, there's a real possibility for social change. So I do think it's possible. Sometimes I'm embarrassed by what our Christian brothers and sisters are doing, but yet I don't want to be. I do quickly say, try to walk in humility. I mean, I do know that I have incredible blind spots. It was when you said that, to be a professor at a major research university like we both are, and the kind of relative security, even for those who are in the academy, have so much more insecurity than I do. Most of those who are in the academy. And so that's an enormous blessing. And so to think about, what can I do? I'm sitting here thinking, how can I do better? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, your corner of the world is really this faith science conversation. Like, I've seen a lot of change over just the last decade in this space. I've seen a lot of change in just the last 3 years, or maybe in the last year, I've seen a lot of change. I don't know where it's going to, but there's a chance, that the carts could be overturned and we have a chance to remake it in a different way. What could this conversation really become to known as 5 years from now that would be good?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am really passionate about having scientists start to think. So in the scientific community, I want scientists to start to think of religious communities as collaborators in terms of increasing gender representation, increasing the proportion of women in certain fields, and increasing the proportion of underrepresented minorities in certain fields. So I think that could be just a watershed if the scientific community and the church community started to think of themselves as collaborators around those two issues in particular. I do think that overall we need to start just considering more diverse voices in the science and faith conversation. That I'm really preaching to the choir here with you and me, but it's good to state it over and over again. That these conversations around faith and science, I do lots and lots of conferences, often are tend to be fairly white conversations. Oops, are you still there?
I'm still there, but you froze up. Hopefully, hopefully people streaming can see, but I can hear you at least.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that the conversations in the faith and science world are often older white men, and there's some amazingly lovely older white men. So, but we do need to bring more conversation partners. We need to really reframe our language.
Well, unfortunately, we've lost Elaine. That's hopefully she'll get back here and join us in a moment. But I think that was a really great conversation. It's probable that she just kind of lost her connection there. I'm really glad you could join us. If she comes back in the next couple minutes, we'll talk about it. But I do want to really say I agree with that. It was recently, I asked on Facebook, why is it that the origins conversation looks so white? And in our current day and time, it was interesting the polarized responses I got. That really upset a lot of people. And a lot of people were also found it a really compelling question because they never asked it before and it really revealed things. The fact of the matter is that the church is really diverse. Society is really diverse. And science isn't just for one part of society. It's for all of us. We should be really wondering how to find ways to include as many voices as we can. Anyhow, there's a lot more to talk to about Elaine, or with Elaine, about all this stuff. She's unfortunately not here, but we will catch up with her again some other time. And until then, thanks a lot for joining us today. And be sure to check out her book. I think it's a good book. It's really worth seeing. Thanks a lot, guys.